Hello, everyone. Welcome tonight. I'm Glenn Rawson, and I am glad that you're here. Thank you for joining me. I just, Adam reminded me last time we talked that if you would take the time, if you haven't already, to either like or follow either the Glenn Rawson Stories Facebook page or the History of the Saints Facebook page, that will enable you, to keep in touch with what we're doing and us to reach out to you better. So again, please, if you will remember before the night is over to like or to follow one or both of those pages. And again, this coming Saturday at This Is the Place Heritage Park in the Garden Center is the next Knowing Joseph seminar. I will talk about that a couple of times on History of the Saints Facebook page throughout this week. Heidi Tucker will be there. Susan Easton Black will be there. Anthony Sweat and Gaina Lynn Condi. This is a powerhouse team of speakers, and I will be the master of ceremonies. I wasn't going to be, but I will be because I'm still here. So that's this coming Saturday at This Is the Place Heritage Park in Salt Lake City, Finding Hope Through the Restoration. Now, as to that, why am I still here? For that matter, why is Adam still here? Well, because 2 days before we were supposed to leave to go to Israel, I tested positive for COVID. And it's been a rough week or so. And I think we're on the mend now. Most of you already know that, but that's why I'm not coming to you tonight from Egypt. That's why I'm sitting in front of the saddle, kind of, I guess, where I belong. And one more time, I keep getting reviews from those of you that have finished reading Tempering Steele, and they've all been very positive, very uplifting. If you're interested in this book, you can get it either at glennrawsonstories.com or you can get it at historyofthesaints.org. But it's good Sunday afternoon reading if you're interested. And again, I know I've said this before, I'll say it again. Those of you who are VIPs with Glenn Rawson Stories, thank you. Thank you so much for all of your support and the help that you are giving to what we're trying to do. So again, many thanks to you. All right, first story tonight. January 1856, Salt Lake City, Utah. 23-year-old Mariner Wood Merrill was hauling logs out of North Mill Creek Canyon there in Salt Lake. The logs were going to be used to make houses. Now, 1856 was a very cold, exceptionally cold winter. The temperature at times was between minus 20 and minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. On one of those very cold days, Mariner was up in the canyon alone. He had cut the 5 logs he needed for house building, placed them side by side in preparation for loading on his bobsleigh. He got the first log on the sleigh and turned around to load the others. He then describes what happened next. Quote, "The one I had on the sled slipped off like it was shot out of a gun and struck me in the hollow of the legs and threw me forward on my face across the 4 logs lying on the ground or ice. In falling, my handspike, which I'd used in loading the first log, slipped out of my hand and out of my reach. And thus," he said, "I found myself with my body lying face downwards across the 4 logs and the 5th log lying across my legs. And I was pinned to the ground with a heavy red pine log 10 inches through at the large end and 22 feet long lying across my legs. And there was no visible means to extricate myself, and there was no one at hand to help, as no one but myself was in the canyon that day." And then Mariner said, "I made up my mind that I must freeze and die all alone in the mountains of Utah." Then he continued, "Many serious thoughts passed through my mind, as you may imagine. In falling on the logs, my breast and stomach were hurt, and it was difficult for me to breathe. I did not conceive what to do under the trying ordeal, but concluded to ask the Lord to help me, which I did in earnest prayer. After calling upon the Lord for some time, I began to make an effort to extricate myself, but all in vain, as I could not move the log that was lying on me. I, however, continued my efforts until I was exhausted and lost all recollection of my situation. So in other words, he passed out. And then he said, "And the first I remembered afterward, I was 1 mile down the canyon, sitting on my load of logs and the oxen going gently along, my overcoat by the side of me, and feeling very cold. I looked at the load and found I had the 5 logs on the sled, 3 on the bottom and 2 on the top, nicely bound, my axe sticking in the top log, my whip lying on the load by my side, my sheepskin with the wool on which I used to sit on, also on the load, and I was sitting on it. I made an effort to get off the load and put on my overcoat, but found I could not do it, as I was so sore in my legs and breast that it was with great difficulty that I could move at all." And then he continued, "I was confined to my house for some days before I could get around again. Who it was that extricated me from under the log, loaded my sled, hitched my oxen to it, and placed me on it, I cannot say, as I do not now, or even then at the time, remember seeing anyone. And I know for a surety no one was in the canyon that day but myself. Hence, I must give the Lord or my guardian angel credit for saving my life and extricating me from so perilous a situation." End of quote. Doesn't that make you think? I've heard from so many of you about stories of angels and unseen hands working on your behalf and those of members of your family from the other side of the veil. The more I listen and study the history of individuals like you, the more convinced I am we are not alone. We work in the presence of family members on the other side of the veil. We work together. And I'll come back and talk more about that later. Another story from Mariner Wood Merrill. He was serving as a bishop in Richmond, Utah, when he was called as the first president of the Logan Temple. The voice of the Lord had whispered to President John Taylor that Bishop Merrill of the Richmond Ward was to preside over the temple. Consequently, Brother Merrill was called and set apart in 1884 as president of the Logan Temple. President Merrill was then called to serve later in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in October 1889. So in addition to being a successful farmer and businessman, Elder Merrill was active in community service and had a large and devoted family, 8 wives and 46 children. In other words, we're talking about a very busy man with great responsibility who depended heavily on others and especially his children. Now, among those that he depended on a great deal to help him with all of his various affairs was his oldest son, Mariner Jr., who managed much of his father's business interests. Well, Mariner Jr. became very ill in December 1889. I read it in Mariner Sr.'s journal. For 2 weeks, the young man declined until December 31st, 1889, Mariner Wood Merrill Jr. passed away. He was 42 years old and left behind a young family. Understandably, this affected his father very deeply, and he reportedly, quote, complained bitterly to the Lord why the son he needed most was taken from him. Until one day, Brother Merrill said, when Mariner W. Merrill, Jr. appeared to his father in his father's apartment on the second story of the Logan Temple. The young man seemed to be right there in the room with him, though his father couldn't see him. And then Mariner Jr. said to his father, quote, "Pa, I am where the Lord wants me to be. I have been called home to preach the gospel to the people you are doing the temple work for. This work is more important than anything I could be doing on earth, and it is not pleasing to the Lord for you to grieve as you were doing over my death." End of quote. President Merrill had never given thought to preaching the gospel to the dead, and when he knew where his son was and what he was doing, he never grieved nor complained again in his life. It was a testimony to Brother Merrill that the Lord knew what he needed to be doing and selected the best man to do it. End of quote. I read a statement just tonight from Elder Neil A. Maxwell, which I can in part paraphrase. Every time there is a release in mortality of a righteous, faithful man or woman, there is a calling anew on the other side to labor in the great work of teaching the gospel and bringing souls unto Christ in the spirit world. And Elder Maxwell went on to say, there will come a day when those so bereaved at the loss of a loved one will be thanked by those for whom their loved ones did the work. In other words, as Elder Maxwell said, there may be 7 billion people on this earth on this side, but there's 10 times that many on the other side of the veil. And the church over there is huge, and they need our help. Continuing on. I talked about this young man last week. Here's another story from his life. Brigham Frederick Grant, affectionately known as B.F. Grant, was born October 17th, 1856, in Salt Lake City. When he was just 6 weeks old, his father, Jedediah M. Grant of the First Presidency, passed away, having worn out his life in the Great Reformation and the Lord's service. And then when B.F. was only 2 years old, his mother married out of the church and left the area. The child was sent first to live with his grandmother. She couldn't take care of him, so eventually B.F. Grant was sent to live with a family in Richmond, Utah. I told you that story last week and talked about how he came into the association of Bishop Merrill. Well, as the boy came of age, B.F. Grant, he became very unhappy where he was, and he made plans to run away. He arranged with a passing wagon boss, a freighter, to catch a wagon train up into the mining camps of Montana. Before anyone could stop him, the boy carried it out and disappeared, leaving behind family, friends, and the faith of his fathers. It is reported that B.F. Grant became a very profane man and that he hadn't the slightest interest in the gospel. One day in Montana, B.F. met a freighter from Utah who, upon learning who he was, invited him to come back to Utah. At about the age of 15, B.F. Grant returned and began working shoveling coal around Corinne, Utah. He hadn't been there long when he was summoned to the office of President Brigham Young. B.F. recorded the conversation as follows, quote, "The next day, I called on President Young at his office, and he happened to be alone. I told him who I was, and he did not merely reach out his hand to shake mine, but he arose from his chair and gave me a father's handshake," which I would assume means he pulled him into a firm embrace. In so doing, He discovered that the calluses on my hands were hard and thick, and he remarked, "My boy, what kind of work are you doing?" I replied, "I'm unloading coal and chopping wood." He then resumed his seat and continued his inquiry regarding my past life and what I had been doing. He remarked, quote, "Isn't it pretty heavy work, shoveling coal and chopping wood for a boy of your age?" End of quote. To which BF replied, "No, sir. I've been used to hard work all my life." President Young answered, "Wouldn't you like to have something easier than your present work? For instance, a position in a store?" I replied, "I haven't got sense enough to work in a store." President Young said, "What do you mean by that?" BF replied, "I can neither read nor write." At that point, BF said, "I discovered this great and good man's heart was touched by this remark. I saw a tear rolling down his cheek. And he took his handkerchief and wiped them off and said, 'My boy, come and live with me. I'll give you a home. I will clothe you. I will send you to school, and you can work during the vacation for me.' BF said, I accepted his kind offer. He became a father to me. He furnished a home. He clothed me and provided an opportunity for me to attend school, and he gave me $5 a week for spending money, which was a very princely allowance in those days of hardship and toil. His own sons would laughingly tell me they thought I was their father's pet." Soon after, BF continued, "Soon after I went to live with President Young, I was given a team and was doing general work on his farm and performing other duties incident to pioneer life. Many a time, he said, I have passed him on the road with a load of gravel, sand, or other materials, and I don't remember an instant in my life this great man, if he saw me, ever failed to recognize me by waving his hand. I cannot help but think, where in the world could you find another man of his importance and busy life who would condescend to recognize or speak to a boy such as I?" President Young's investment in the lad paid off. B.F. Grant went on to become a successful businessman, a farmer, police chief, hospital administrator, and finally general manager of the Deseret News, not to mention a righteous, faithful, contributing priesthood man of God. Such is the power of love and kindness. My friends, you can say what you like about President Young and how he has been vilified in history almost as much as the prophet Joseph Smith. But he was a good man, a man of charity, kindness, compassion, and a prophet of God. Okay. As has been my tradition, hold on a sec. Okay. As has been my tradition in the last few firesides, would you allow me to quote a little bit out of this book? Again, one of those points or one of those things in the book that I think is important. Quoting, and it's on my prompter tonight. J.O. was unusually tense and impatient. He had run against deadlines before, but for some reason, this one was the most pressing deadline he had ever known. He pushed his rig as hard as he could on the hills and sharp corners. His frustration was heightened by the fact that the car in front of him was going at least 15 miles per hour under the speed limit. J.O. had tried every trick he knew to let the car in front of him know that he was in a hurry. The guy seemed totally oblivious to everything but the wonderful scenery in every direction. Gritting his teeth, J.O. sweltered in his driver's seat. The only way he was going to make any time was to get around this guy. He would lose a full 30 minutes against the deadline by following him. But there were very few places for a rig as long and slow as his to pass on that stretch of road. J.O. waited and watched for his opening, following the car as close as he could, and suddenly, there it was. If he hurried, there might be just enough time to make it around him. He hit his left turn signal, checked his mirror, and pulled the wheel to the left. He rammed his accelerator all the way to the floor, but for some strange, inexplicable reason, there was not the usual responding surge of power. The truck seemed sluggish. Slowly, it gained on the car until he was driving alongside. J.O. cast a nervous glance out his left window. The Snake River was several hundred feet down a nearly vertical embankment on his left. The moment his eyes returned forward, his heart leaped into his throat. A large motorhome rounded the corner ahead of him in the oncoming lane. Its lights flashed in warning as it bore down on him. In an instant, the gravity of his situation became clear. The oncoming vehicle was not slowing down, and there was not enough room to pass three abreast on that mountain road, even if he wanted to. He was now going faster than 65 miles per hour, and there was no way to stop in time. He had less than 3 seconds to do something. J.O. touched his brakes and slowed the rig as he tried to get back behind the car that he was trying to pass, but to his utter horror and astonishment, the car slowed with him. J.O. looked at the driver of the other car. The man was laughing insanely. "What are you doing, you idiot?" J.O. screamed, waving his arm at the man. "Let me get back," he cried. The man only laughed harder as he made an obscene gesture. J.O. looked forward again. Time was up. Someone was going to die if he didn't do something. At that instant, he made his decision and jerked the wheel of his rig hard to the left. The rear axles of his trailer raised off the highway as the rig threatened to flip. "No!" J.O. screamed hoarsely as the 65-foot semi-trailer left the pavement and shot over the cliff toward the roiling river below. Slowly, gracefully, like some great juggernaut, the huge rig rolled in midair. J.O. watched the world out his windows go from sky to river to ground. Any moment, he knew the 80,000-pound rig would smash down on top of him and snuff out his life like a bug under a car tire. "Oh, Father, forgive me," he pleaded, his eyes clenched shut. J.O. shot up in his bed, throwing the light blanket across the truck's sleeper. His chest heaved as he struggled for breath, and he looked around wildly in the darkened interior. Disoriented, he collapsed back onto his bed, unable to figure out where he was or what had happened. Slowly, he sat back up and tried to orient himself. End of quote. If you're interested in this book, it's called Tempering Steele. Now, this next story, I don't know why. And Diana, if you're watching this tonight from Calgary, I don't know why. But of the hundreds of stories, this one of yours came back to me. I shared it probably 2 years ago when we first started, and for some odd reason, I felt the need to share it again. So if anybody out there needs to hear this story of Diana's, well, it's for you. Quoting now. Diana went to church with a friend and enjoyed the sermon that was offered. After it was over, she asked her friend if there was more. Her friend asked, "What do you mean?" And Diana said, "I don't know. My chest feels like there should be something more." End of quote. Well, that night, Diana went home, deep in thought. Before crawling into bed, she knelt down and asked Heavenly Father, if there was a church on the face of the earth that had all His truth in it. As she described it, she didn't want to bounce around from church to church, picking up truth here and there. That night, Diana experienced a remarkable dream. She said, quote, "In my dream, I stood in a room that was divided down the middle by a line. I stood on the line, and on the right side of me was people, noise, partying, and on the left side of me was white walls. I looked at the right side and said, I'm going over to that side. Somewhere in my dream," she said, "a fire broke out, and I could not get out of the room. There were no doors and no windows. I began to panic and thought, I don't want to die. I haven't done what I'm supposed to do. I looked to the left side of the line, and all I saw was a hand, the cuff of a white shirt and the cuff of a blue suit jacket. I grabbed that hand," Diana said, "and I was pulled to the other side of the line, and I woke up, and it was morning. I thought that was the strangest dream," she said, "I've ever had in my whole life, and I had no idea what it meant." End of quote. Well, later on that same evening, Diana went to visit her grandmother. While she was there, a knock came at the door. She opened it, and there, standing in front of her, were two smiling young men. One of them reached out his hand. Diana looked down, and she said, quote, "All I saw was the hand, the cuff of a white shirt, and the cuff of the blue suit jacket. I took that hand, and he said, 'We are missionaries for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we have a message for you.'" Diana said, "I teared up and said, 'I know.'" She invited them in. As they taught her about the prophet Joseph Smith, her heart raced because it was all so familiar, like she'd heard it before. She was baptized 1 month later, and my friend is faithful to this day. Sometimes the angels and the messengers of the Almighty are as mortal as we are, and thank heavens, I have had the same angels in my life. Even now, when I've been so sick the last couple of weeks, I've had angelic friends on this side of the veil who've kept track of me and helped me, and I am so, so grateful for them. Diana, thank you again for that story. Now, next story. When we speak of the rescue of the handcart people of 1856, Martin and Willie, and again, I'm speaking of this so frequently because of the book that we're writing on this. When we speak of the handcart people and the rescue of 56, it was not just those brave boys who went out on the trail. It was the unified effort by the saints as a people that brought this heroic effort to pass. It was October 5th, 1856, when President Brigham Young initially called for volunteers to go out and bring the handcart immigrants in off the plains. Well, President Young continued that call for volunteers, wagons, and supplies well into December until all the immigrants were safely delivered. President Young even sent out requests to the different bishops in the settlements. John Lowe Butler was the bishop in Spanish Fork, Utah, and he received one of those requests. He recorded the following in his journal, quote, Brother Brigham gave orders in all the settlements to rig up teams to go back and bring the sufferers in. Now the snow was from 6 to 15 feet deep, and there was no road broke across the mountains at all. The word came down to me to rig up 6 teams and send 2 men to every team for teamsters, and there were to be 4 mules or horses to each wagon, and the wagons were to be loaded with horse feed, provisions, clothing, and every comfort of life that could be sent. Now this all was to be done, he said, by donation. So I called the people together, Bishop Butler said, and told them the situation of their brethren and sisters, and then we had to rig up teams and send men out for them. This was in December, and it was bitter cold. The snow in the valley here was 18 inches deep on the level, and it was snowing in the mountains all the time. We got them all rigged up, and here it is. And I never had less trouble getting up such an expedition, for the saints were willing and on hand to do almost anything. My son, Taylor, I sent out with them to superintend the expedition. He drove a wagon as well, and he told me how he found the saints and how the road was, he said, that there were teams stretched out from the city to Fort Bridger, that they had to have men shoveling out snow and breaking the road, and in some places the snow was up above the wagon bows on each side. And they found the saints in an awful condition, some with their feet froze and some with their fingers froze, and they had no food to eat. And he said that he never saw such a sight before. It was dreadful. And he said that they, the rescued, were so overjoyed they did not know what to do hardly. They were all picked up and fed and clothes given to them. When they camped at night, there were a whole lot of the boys would break a road to a tree, cut it down for firewood, and when they were coming back, they never saw the sun for 6 days, and it snowed all the time. And they had to break the road all over again. And in coming down the big mountain, they never locked a wheel, but guyed off and let the hub of the off wheel drag in the snow, and so they came down the mountain. They brought some of the folks down to Spanish Fork. Bishop Butler said, and I never saw such objects in my life as they were. End of quote. Just imagine, my dear friends, if the bishop of your ward came and called, and we had a situation like 1856 again. Imagine if the call to minister was answered in your ward today in such a fashion as it was in the winter of 56. Last story for tonight. And again, thank you so much for being here tonight and for listening. I remember one morning when my children were small, I sent them off to school. And then following a feeling, I ran outside just as my 6-year-old son went out the door. This is Adam. This is a lot of years ago. He was just going out the door to go to school. And I felt something as he went out the door, and I didn't want to resist it. I felt a warmth and an affection that I just had to express. So I ran out the door behind him, caught up with him, pulled him into my arms, and said, I love you, son. And he responded, I love you too, Dad. And then I lifted him to the other side of an icy puddle, too wide for him to cross, and he went on his way to school. Now, since then, I've thought, what is love? We hear it thrown around in movies My wife's had me watching a few of these Hallmark movies lately. They're not too bad. What is love? It gets thrown around in movies like dirty socks. Well, the dictionary defines love as a feeling or an affection that we have for someone or something because of some benefit we receive from it. That's the dictionary. Well, that kind of love is what the scriptures call the love of men. It is the kind that waxes cold. We hear people say, I love my family and I'm grateful for all that they do for me. You ever heard that? Well, what happens when your family stops doing for you? Or we don't care for what they are doing for us? Well, the love of men dies. And the object of that love is tossed out and too often replaced. The love of God is different than the love of men. It is pure, unfailing, never dies. It endures forever. It is not fickle. I can only imagine, my friends, how charged with emotion the upper room must have been on the last night of the Savior's life, the night of the Last Supper. A new commandment I give unto you, Jesus declared, that ye love one another as I have loved you. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another. Interesting. Wait a minute. The call to love one another is not and was not then a new commandment. It had been given to Moses. I'm sure it was given to Adam and Eve. So what was new then when Jesus said, a new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you? Well, from that day forward, the Lord's disciples were to love with his love, or love as he loved with his love. The old commandment was, all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. But the new commandment is, do unto others as Jesus would. Still in the quiet of that upper room, Jesus continued, if ye love me, keep my commandments. Notice that Jesus did not say, if you love me, make sure you tell me every day. The world is full of those who draw near with their lips, but their hearts are cold and distant. God's love is affection expressed with action. This is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. There it is. The highest expression of love known to God or man is to lay down one's life for another. The most perfect way to say, I love you, is to do for that person as the Master would. Perfect love is inspired love. Perfect love almost always involves sacrifice on the part of the person expressing it. Within moments of teaching them this doctrine, Jesus himself put his love into expression. He said, that the world may know that I love the Father, and as the Father gave me commandment, even so I do. Arise, let us go hence. And hence was the Garden of Gethsemane and the cross and the empty tomb. The apostles wanted him to stay. They grieved and wept over him. He was breaking their hearts that night, and he knew it. But he also knew that the greatest love he could express now was not what they wanted, but what God wanted for them. The Lord taught and cheered them as well as he could, as well as they could understand, sealed them up unto the Father by his prayers and faith, and then left them for the atonement. Gethsemane and Golgotha were the greatest expression of love this world has ever known. Jesus poured out his soul unto death. He laid down his life for the Father and for us, and then took that life up again and gave it to us forever. Not all will receive of God's love. Hardened hearts cannot feel it, but it is nonetheless real. Do not ever judge the presence of God's love by what you do or do not feel or see, for it is always there. It is faithful. It never dies. You may destroy your sensitivity to that love by a hardened heart or by disobedience, but you can never kill his affection for you. Not now, not ever. Later on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, the resurrected Lord asked Peter, "Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me?" "Yea, Lord," Peter answered, "thou knowest that I love thee." "Feed my sheep," came the Master's reply. His disciples mattered so much to him. We mattered so much to him that he gave his best men for them, and he still does. Now, you come to God now, and he fills you with his love and sends you out to what? Feel it or give it away? Give it away. Starting with your family. You love them as you love them because you get to do for them, not because they do for you. This is love. My friends, my love to you. Good night, and God bless.